The presentation today that I'm going to present to you is called Dreaming, Death and Memory, Sketches for a Heathen Cosmology. First, I just wanted to say a few words of gratitude. Just a few thanks, obviously, to the organisers of the conference and to everyone who's come to the conference, whether you're physically here or not. My wife for being very patient with me, Danica for kind of alerting us to the idea that this thing was happening. Our friends Ted and Leah, who aren't actually here, but who are very kindly putting us up for the weekend. So yeah, just all those things made this possible for me to do this presentation. So I just wanted to say thank you for that. So a couple of quotes to put in the back of your mind. First quote is from a band called Agalloch. As I'm stalked by the shadow of death's hand, my heathen pride is scarred across the land. And a second quote from Aleister Crowley. Awake from dream, the truth is known. Awake from waking, the truth is the unknown. So this presentation is about heathen mythology or heathen cosmology, and I kind of use the words interchangeably. Just bear with me on that one. And the attempt is to try and schematize that heathen cosmology into three overarching themes: dreaming, death, and memory. And of course, going with that, they always imply their companions, so life, wakefulness, and amnesia. But before I attempt to do this, I want to first make this general disclaimer that this is a very generalized kind of thesis that I'm going to present, and the material we have to work with is incredibly fragmentary. So there's going to be a lot of issues, and it's really important to appreciate that I'm trying to create a map, but the map is never the territory, and especially not with this subject matter. So, take it all with a sense of irony. Particularly, there's two caveats I'd like to make. The first one is about confirmation bias. So confirmation bias, we tend to see things that fit with what we already believe, and we tend to ignore things that don't fit. Or, Robert Anton Wilson says the proof of proof proves what the thinker thinks. In contemporary reconstructed polytheism, this stuff goes on so much, and it's one of my pet peeves. And I'm certain that I'm as guilty of it as everyone else, because research shows that even when you know about confirmation bias, you still indulge in it. So I'm just going to put it out there that it's quite possible that there's some other evidence out there that totally shreds all of what I have to say. And I invite you to think of it, because that will help me to grow as well, even if I have to sacrifice my ego. The second piece relates to that. It has to do with the source material. So I'm going to look at some mythological poetry, sagas, folk tales, secondary source interpretations. I'm going to talk a little about certain philosophers, all kinds of different jumble of stuff. And a lot of this material is actually kind of secondhand. The sagas, even the prose Edda and the poetic Edda are recorded not by heathens. They weren't even a literate culture. So I just again want to say, that's a big problem. And a lot of this stuff that I'm going to be talking about, it might sound like so-and-so did this and it describes that. And the reality is that this could be some concoction that some monk just threw in there because who knows why. And it has nothing to do with heathenism whatsoever. And there's egg on my face, and none of us even know it. So that's the second proviso. So confirmation bias is deadly, and we've got to be careful with the source material and have a sense of irony. So having undermined myself, and just kind of put some brackets around this whole kind of Don Quixote kind of adventure. So we're going to start with the world tree. We're going to start with memory. And memory begins as a world tree. And I happen to have a t-shirt that has which was totally unscripted. I promise. And my starting place comes from two people. Paul Borchardt, who wrote an amazing book called The Well and the Tree, which is very hard to get now. And Bill Lindsay, who is a Reconstructionist heathen who kind of translated a lot of Borchardt's stuff from academic into concrete. So here's Bill Lindsay, and he's trying to sum up what Germanic cosmology looks like. And he says this: the world of humans, gods, and other beings are directly expressed by the tree. So this tree that unites everything. However, all significant worldly concerns of the tree, are related and structured by that part of the cosmos configured by the well of Erd. We'll come back to that. Which expresses that portion of universal reality lying beyond the direct reach of worldly tree-related beings, be they humans, gods, or others. The iconography of the tree and well mutually interact and support each other. The action of humans, gods, and other beings layer and fill the well, and these layering strata themselves structure and influence the affairs of men. So we have this image, the world tree, called Yggdrasil by the gods, called Lerad by human beings, called Mimimave by the giants. And it binds all these different worlds together, and it binds all these beings together. And the point is that it's this complex matrix of relationships, and it's dynamic. And what this tree is kind of suggesting is that a truth, and the truth is the simultaneous oneness and difference of all things. So any one thing only exists on condition of its place within this huge nexus. It's just a point on this massive multidimensional grid. But even though it kind of dissolves into these relationships, by the same token, that nexus of relationships is absolutely unique in time and space. It's non-repeatable. And to my mind, that makes it sacred. So you have this whole complex that's sacred, woven out of all of these arbitrary points that are fleeting, that are sacred, and yet they're gone, and then they're again, and then, so it's constant movement, constant relationship, something, so it requires this honouring of the very being of this phone here, which is not just another iPhone, it is this iPhone in this place in this time, and yet that's only possible on the sense of this whole macro scale, this whole ineffable universe that we're in. So there is no individuality without union with the greater whole, and there's no greater whole without all these fragments. So we have this tension of universal in particular, but also this symbiosis. And it's a contradiction, and we have to kind of move past, with our rational minds, that contradiction. In a way, this is kind of like that old idea, as above, so below, which is not quite the same idea, but it's a similar sort of principle, and we might touch on that a little bit more. So this image, this concept of this world tree, the world tree is animated by what Bill Lindsay refers to as the flow of the waters. So the waters that he's talking about come from three wells, either one or three, and we can go back and forth about that. I'm going to alternate between wells or well. It doesn't really matter that much for the purpose of this essay, whether there's three wells or one well. They're at the foot of the tree. Each of them is under a root of the tree. And the wells are the well of Erd, which is that which has become, the well of Mimir, memory, and the well of Vergelmir, which is the bubbling cauldron or the steaming cauldron, which is where the rivers of the world come from. And it's also where the dragon Nurkog lives, so curled around this well. So what happens is this water flows up from these wells into the roots, up through the tree, and then it respires out at the top as dew and kind of trickles back down into the wells again. And then wrapped around the tree, we have all these different animals, and some of them are tearing at the tree, and some of them are doing all kinds of strange things on this tree. But what keeps the tree alive is the Norns. And these are three giant women who live around the well of Earth. And one of them has the name Earth. And they mix up mud and water from this well of memory, and they place it on the roots. And that's what keeps the tree going, that action of this memorizing almost, you could say. So that in a nutshell is kind of like this portrait of what the heathen worldview is, according to Borchardt and Lindsay. And it's a pretty compelling argument they make. You have these elements of causality, interrelatedness, impermanence, animism. But the strand that unites all these themes is memory. Memory. So when we speak of memory, we're talking about the well of the all-wise giant Mimir. And it's a well that has such wisdom that Odin even sacrifices his eye, rips it out. And think about that, to reach into your own eye socket and just pull it out and drop it in that water, purely to get a draft from that well, a draft of wisdom from that well. And we're talking about the well of Erd, the most primal Norn, that which has become. So we're talking about the repository of all history, of the layers of every action and reaction that has ever happened. We're talking about the well Vergelmir, which all rivers flow from this well. It's like the primal artesian spring from which everything flows. So it's memory that's running through this tree, it's this constant movement. Memory is the liquid lifeblood of the universe. It's the precipitation. It's the vessel of all change. The universe, it nourishes itself through this moving remembrance. And it's that mud and that water from the Norns that is used to convey that memory, to keep things rolling. So it's almost like we're floating on the surface of this infinitely deep and complex reservoir of time and recollection. And even if we forget that everything is sacred, we can never truly deny this process. It keeps moving regardless. And if we do deny it, we might end up on the wrong side of it, and I'll touch on that. But it cannot be ultimately denied. It will always overrule all. So there's an implication that Bill Lindsay talks about, an implication of this image of living, flowing, interwoven remembrance. And I'm going to read to you what Lindsay says about this, because this is kind of interesting. He says, "No object, no thing could be presented, given, bought, borrowed, or stolen, which did not have a history tightly bound to it, trailing like a ribbon behind it far into the past. Historical qualities of an object, such as its sentimental value, sordidness, luckiness, or its inherent evil, could be, and often were, far more important than its actual function in daily life. The idea of underlying or hidden relationships," and he puts that in inverted commas, "within all that is permeated the entire system of Northern thought, showing up initially in the Edda's descriptions of the creation of the universe, weaving an intricate pattern of relationships through the literature of the sagas, and beginning to slowly lose importance only long after the conversion to Christianity." And he goes on, "In fact, vestiges of this concept continue to this day, although in contemporary culture, keeping an object for sentimental value is generally considered frivolous and somewhat silly. The tradition of attending to the history of an event, person, place, or an object is persistent and tenacious, but the importance of that tradition has been lost." And so he concludes, "Restoration of the importance of relationships, connections, and underlying currents is not to be overlooked. It is the core of the ancient Northern philosophy." I just think there's so much in that. So for me, where my mind goes when I read that, is my mind turns to how that illuminates the fact that lineage and ancestry has a significance in heathen mythology, heathen tradition, heathen practice. So what is lineage? Lineage is a recollection. I can recite my lineage, or I cannot. Lineage is a recollection of some of the unique causal relationships which bind each of us to our place in the tree, and which, and this is the really important bit, allow us to access the flow of the waters of remembrance. So therefore, ancestor worship is about two things. It's about recovering our connection to this universal truth of this dynamic cosmos, this recursive cosmos. But it's also about centering ourselves as a specific identity within that process, that moving dynamic process. So I feel that, I would argue that if you really run ancestor worship to its logical conclusion, you have two aspects to it. One is a sense of open-mindedness and curiosity about the world beyond, the Utgard. And the other is a sense of groundedness in one's own heritage and one's own place, the Othala. And I want to say that, to my mind, that stands in real distinction to what we see of chauvinistic kind of modern politics, ethnocentric politics, which is all about this distorted idea of an Othala rune, right? But it's not really ancestor worship, because it doesn't appreciate that if you really follow that line of the ancestors, something else opens up that's just huge. And yet you don't lose that sense of self. There's nothing brittle about it. That leads me to my next point of reflection, and that is that where there's memory, there is amnesia. And I'm going to suggest to you that human beings are made to forget. And I'm going to engage in a logical fallacy and appeal to an authority to demonstrate that human beings are made to forget. So Martin Heidegger, philosopher, I'm going to read you a little bit of Heidegger and then I'm going to translate it into something that makes sense. Heidegger says that, for the most part, Dasein is lost in its world. Its understanding, as a projection upon possibilities of being, has diverted itself thither. What does that mean? So Dasein is kind of like the grab bag of the structures of human beingness. I don't want to say consciousness, because it's more than that. Consciousness creates this disembodied image. He's not talking about that. He's talking about just us here. What is the full range of possibilities of being a human being? That's Dasein, right? So Dasein, and it just literally means being there. in the German. Just being there, that's what it is. So we are lost in our world. Our understanding as a projection upon possibilities of being, of what could be, has diverted itself into the world. So we're always moving out from ourselves. We're always engaged in the daily doings. We lose the sense of the meaning and significance of our acts. We become habituated to life. It can become stale. So we become habituated to this vast, interconnected, sacred process that we're a part of that composes us completely. And yet we can become totally blasé about it and just get up and go to work. We're made to forget. So it's kind of a forgetful bewilderment, or maybe a forgetful bewilderment. And it's something to be appreciated, though. I don't want to say that this forgetfulness is bad. It's necessary. We need it. And it gives us opportunities to remember again. And if we didn't have those opportunities, we wouldn't have the joy of, right? I talk about that in Sufism a lot, It's kind of like Rumi is like, well, I feel terrible, I've forgotten God, but I know I'm going to find it again. And when I do, it's going to be great. Similar kind of idea. I think Sufism and heathenism have actually quite a lot in common. So how do we help maintain and have those moments of recollection? Mythic symbols, spiritual observances, devotion, art, runes, it could be anything. Everyone's going to have their own way. But what's underlying that? What's really going to help us break this veil of amnesia? How can we move to a place where this veil of amnesia doesn't cut us off totally from our sense of remembering that everything is memory? Okay, so we'll go to Martin Heidegger again. So what's Heidegger's answer? Well, Heidegger comes to this place where he suggests that in the face of my experience of my death, I am called. And I'm called to the sense of the ineradicable possibilities of my being. I'm called to a sense of radical uniqueness of my place in this world. And it's not just thinking about death in general. Anyone else's death isn't going to do that for me, in most cases. But if I really dwell on the possibility that, he has this funny phrase, you can't deputize your death, right? I always love that. I don't know what it is in the German, but that's how they translate it, and it's great. You can't, so, I shot the sheriff, I did not shoot the deputy, that's not, you can't deputize it. It puts you exactly where you are. It really kind of brings everything into perspective. And then that makes me wonder, if this guy doing this phenomenological analysis in the 20th century concludes that death is one way, I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's one way to withdraw from that bewilderment, then what does this mythology of memory have to say about death? Well, when you start looking at the sources, one thing is clear. There's a lot of contradictions and a lot of confusing things, but death is clearly incredibly important in the heathen mythos. And there's so many fragments, and I'm just going to be selective and confirmation bias, But here we go. So, death. Death and the flow of the waters of memory. Life and death nourish one another. So let's think about ancestor worship. Reverence for lineage and appreciation for the past. Those who don't know the past are condemned to repeat it, right? What is that? That is morbid. That is dealing with death straight up. So H.R. Ellis Davison, talking about the Vanir, so this is the pantheon of fertility, right? Or, we can take them that way if we want, we don't have to. But a strong argument could say that these are real fertile beings. She says, the Vanir, as a whole, may have especially strong links with bringing the conception of fertility of nature into the world of the dead also. What she's saying is that death and fertility are deeply entwined in the northern imagination. And why? Well, all around us we learn that decomposition is a necessity for growth and for new possibilities. We know that human sacrifices, which is a pretty big deal, right? Human sacrifice? Yeah. Human sacrifices are intimately connected, so death, intimately connected to symbols of memory. So you look at the Tacitus' account of the Nerthus cult. They have this wagon for this goddess and it travels all around this region and brings fertility. And when they bring it back, the slaves clean totally cleanse everything for this wagon, and then they're executed and thrown into this lake. The lake is the body of water, it's the well. There's also this account that at Old Uppsala there was this great tree and there was a well at the foot of the tree. And I wonder if this is historical or whether it's some kind of mythological projection, I don't know.
Not unless it's changed.
Oh yeah, it doesn't exist anymore if it did exist. But they would have a sacrifice each year, or every 9 years, where they would have a slave and they would kill this person and they would throw the body in the water, and if the body floated back to the surface, that was a real bad sign. So that's a pretty potent fusion of death and memory right there in these cultic practices. We have this accounts of sacred kings being killed to break a drought. Again, same process. We have this death dragon, Nithog, that gnaws on the corpses. He just breaks everything down to its finest chunks. And he lives wrapped around the life-giving waters of the well Vogelme. So, it doesn't seem to be an accident that the wells of memory are at the foot of the world along with the underworld. Assuming they are at the foot of the world. I'm just going to take it as read they are. We can argue about that because cosmic geography is weird, but there's definitely some connections there, Nithog and so forth. Now, when Odin seeks to gain knowledge, he goes to dark, underworldly places. It's this journey that he makes. Or he might raise the dead. So, for example, he raises the seeress in Voluspa, and she informs him with the mythic history of the universe, and even what it means is probably going to happen. And also in Helga Fida Hjorvardssonas 2, the second Helgi sits out on a mound overnight, and the spirit of the dead person in the mound offers him knowledge. So again, this idea of mound sitting really seems worthy of a little bit more reflection. There's more stuff here connecting memory and death. So in the Fleck Jarbok, there's a shepherd called Halbjorn. And Halbjorn has this habit of sitting on the funeral mound of this dead poet, Thorleif, and sometimes even sleeps there overnight, which is kind of morbid. It's kind of cool. It's very black metal. I approve. So Halbjorn had this hope that he could compose verses to memorialize Thorleif, and specifically Thorleif's poetic ability. But he found that he just didn't have the talent. He just didn't have it. He wasn't one of those people that could do it. One night, he's dreaming atop this mound, and Thorleif appears to him in a dream. And Thorleif teaches him a verse of poetry. And at that moment, the gift is passed on. And from that point, Halbjorn can become a poet. Death, memory. So poetry is this force of life, right? It's excitation. So the idea that you could get it through necromantic communication, that's pretty potent stuff. And I wonder, in these kind of parallels, is the underworld, sometimes I think of it as like the deep mind or the unconscious, connecting with all these different layers of experience. I connect this as well to, there's the story of Bolverker. So in the story of Bolverker, there's the mead of inspiration is stolen by this giant called Suttung. And Suttung heaves it off to his mountain. So Odin, through skullduggery, in fact, there is literally some digging involved, he becomes a serpent and he gets in under this mountain. He goes up and he seduces Suttung's daughter and he drinks all this mead, and then he goes to the top of the mountain, turns into an eagle and flies home with the mead. And Suttung fails to catch him. And some of the mead falls out of Odin's mouth and lands in the mouths of poets down here. So, if you ever see me walking around like this, wishful thinking is active. Now, what's interesting about that story is that Thorbert Lindlier has done some really cool linguistic analysis and other things, looking at the themes of death, dragons, and grave mounds. And he shows that you could probably see Suttung's mountain as being a grave mound, and that the snake is really intimately connected to death. And snakes, dragons are all interconnected. You've got this dragon Nithog living around the well, right? So Odin is assuming this necromantic form, entering the grave mound, stealing this liquid of life. I'm not sure how Gunlord, the daughter of Suttung, fits into this death thing. Maybe Thorbert talks about it, I can't remember off the top of my head. And then comes back to life, comes out the top. Now, H.R. Ellis Davidson notes there's some interesting stuff in the sagas and the way they talk about the dead in the mounds. If you want to summon someone from a burial mound to get underworldly wisdom, you're not summoning up the spirit, the ghost. There's no ghost. You're summoning up the body. You're summoning up this creaky, horrible, stinky, rotten thing. The whole bit comes at once. And that's kind of weird when we think about contemporary ideas of body and mind. We kind of think like, well, the body's not important, but the mind, that would be where the knowledge is, right? It's kind of a post-Christian kind of notion. Now, Ellis Davidson, she kind of has this view that, well, all this stuff was recorded centuries after the heathen age, And maybe they were just maybe this is meant to be a metaphor, and these dudes writing this down, because they probably were dudes, were just kind of being very literal. They didn't really understand what was going on. This is not a B-grade zombie flick. It's just a misunderstanding. But I disagree with her. And there's a film called Dances of Ecstasy, which is about sacred dance around the world. And there are certain African dancing practices where they talk about possession by an Orisha. And someone who's possessed by an Orisha, their body is transformed. It's not their normal body. It's another body. It's a different body. Now, most Westerners would think of possession as being about the mind being changed, right? There's some kind of it's a personality. That's what it looks like. You gave me a strange look there, but I'd love to come back to that. But so we have that mind-body distinction, whereas in this tradition, that distinction isn't being made, and so that makes me wonder. Maybe what's happening is that distinction wasn't made amongst the old Germanic peoples either. Maybe the reason that it seems weird to us is just because we are sitting on 2,000 years of evolving Christian theology about the separation of body and mind. And then now we have like a modern atheistic model which is still essentially thinks in a dualist way, even though it doesn't believe in mind. It just still thinks that way. So we're talking about a continuum. And I don't know, I think that is an interesting way that cross-cultural comparison can really enrich our understanding of heathenism or whatever it is. Some people are like, no, you mustn't ever, don't cross the streams. For me, that doesn't work, and I think this is a nice demonstration of how that comparison can be really helpful. So this leads me to the tradition of the mini horn, the memory horn, and the practice of remembering the dead through toasting. So it's a practice that still continues today, and I think Bill Lindsay in that quote talking about the sentimental value of things, he's kind of alluding to this. People still do it. We still have toasts. We still remember people. Certainly not just heathens that do it. And maybe people don't do it with that sense of self-awareness of what they're doing. But it's pretty powerful that it's still going on in some form or other. So we have this idea of calling these forces into the present. And partly it's about nourishing ourselves as the living. And it's a communal rite of remembrance. It's a really powerful thing, that communal aspect, so we have this point of where this moment and this time and place where the individual, the tribe, the natural world, everything, the tree, the well, they're all understood as being symbiotically connected. But they don't just dissolve into like an undifferentiated mass. It's almost like these relationships become elucidated in all these really beautiful ways, through that practice of raising that horn. So it's almost like in that localized acknowledgement through the symbol, through the mini horn, we then reconnected and reintegrated into this much bigger picture. And that's awfully good for us that we do this, because the dead want to be remembered. The dead want to be remembered. Thorleif and Halbjorn, the poet and the Sitting on the Mound, is a great example of that. Thorleif really wants to be remembered. He's very happy ultimately when he can see that Halbjorn is serious about this. He will pass that gift on. So memory is not only the source of the flowing cosmic waters, it's also the means by which the past, by which the dead are drawn up into the world tree's roots, the clay, the mud, and drawn back into living manifestation. So our amnesia is what is destroying the world, and our memory is what can save it. And from this point of view, the lack of historical perspective that we have in modernity is not only disappointing socially and kind of boring, but it's a spiritual disaster. On the other hand, if you can have death and memory into a dynamic relationship at a cultural level, at an individual psychological level, well, maybe we can go beyond existentialism. Here's a quote from the Havamal, attributed to Odin. And it's usually read in a very existential kind of way. Cattle die and kinsmen die, thyself eke soon wilt die, but fair fame will fade never, I ween, for him who wins it. There's a wonderful poem by the Roman poet Catullus. Catullus' poetry is all about his love affairs, and there's one love affair where he got jilted. And his poem is about what a complete jerk this guy is that's stolen his girl from. And he ends with saying, well, I get the last laugh because, 2,000 years from now, people are still going to be reading about what a jerk you are. And you read this poem and you're like, holy crap, this guy. But that's not what we're talking about. I mean, that's one way of looking at what this quote means. But fair fame will fade never, I ween, for him who wins it. The reputation lives on. But it's a process. It's not just about, I'm going to be the biggest, greatest, whatever, and then everyone's going to think I'm awesome. It's deeper than that. It's about becoming a part of the fabric. It's the weight of the good actions I've done that won me the fame. That's what becomes woven powerfully into the world. The fame itself is almost like an epiphenomenon. The wish of the dead to be remembered can lead to some surprising circumstances. Vatnsdæler's saga relates the tale of Jökull, who is mortally wounded in battle. And he grabs at his victorious foe and he says, "Don't let my name pass away." And he asks him to pass it on. And I quote, "If a son be granted to you or to your son, give him my name." That's a pretty strong desire to have one's name passed on if you're begging the person who's just murdered you to give it to their offspring. And this kind of thing also happens within families, not just across lines of enmity. In Svafdæler's saga, Thorolf promises to pass his hamingja, his luck, his power, on to any son of his brother who should also be named Thorolf. And here again, the connection between death and fertility. Thorolf says, if you don't pass my name on, it will risk passing out of use like withered grass. Like withered grass, my name will be gone. My hamingja will be gone. This sense of rebirth through memory is not a fait accompli among blood relations, therefore. The name has to go as well. And it seems that for the ancestral heathens, it could even occur between people who had no blood shared, or even who were murdering each other. So memory clearly has profound importance. It has the power to carry the dead back into the world of the living, maybe not literally, but nonetheless. So we need to act regularly to keep those waters flowing through reverent observance. Otherwise, we're back into that forgetfulness, the bewilderment, the gibberish that Heidegger, I quoted you. So given the foregoing, I think we need to be cautious about reducing modern heathenry to a matter of biological continuity, as some heathens tend to do. It seems pretty clear that for the old heathens, it was the social and spiritual practices of naming and remembering that were necessary for the preservation of lineage. Biological relatedness was great, but it wasn't a necessity.
Do you know if there's anything in there about it being possible to steal someone's hamingja or luck by taking the same name?
I don't know necessarily about taking the same name, but that's a great question. And I want to say if it's not in there, it should be. Because that's totally, yeah.
Like, dude stole my name.
I could totally see that, yeah. We'll talk a little more names when I get to Odin, because he's got a lot of them. So maybe we can explore that more. That's a great question. I don't know. That's a good one. So what seems to be most essential in these examples of the old worldview is this commitment to cultural lineage and integrity of tradition. It's not about resting on the laurels of membership in a group, like in a biological group or a familial category. And that's really fortunate for us, because most heathen groups in the modern day are not based on family relationship. They're based on people with shared interests who get along well. So we're fortunate that there's a precedent for that we don't have to have these blood ties in order to pass on luck and lineage. We can create new community and we don't have to have that. We're really lucky. Otherwise we'd be screwed. There'd be no reconstruction. I mean, we could still make something up, but whatever it is, I mean, it's already kind of sketchy, right? Reconstructed religion is always sketchy, but we'd be totally screwed if that was the case. So the importance of the remembrance of names to the continuation of memory and lineage lends a deeper significance to the fact that Odin, the primordial creator of humanity, the god of death, possesses a vast array of names. There's 100 and something of them. So either he's very important to remember, or else he's just very multifaceted, and so if you really want to remember this guy, you're just going to have to work. And it's no accident that he's a god of death. So the Aesir and the Vanir, these two families of gods, have a war. And as part of the peace settlement, the Vanir are given Hunir and Mimir, thought and memory. The Aesir hand them over as captives. And Hunir is set up to be this great sage, right? But what happens is every time the Vanir asks him a question, he's like, let me go and ask Mimir first and see what he's got to say about it. And then he'd come back and the advice would be excellent. But the Vanir are kind of like, we've been ripped off. We've been sold 2 sages and we only really got 1. So off comes Mimir's head and they send it back to Odin with an upraised finger. I made that up, about the upraised finger. But they did send it back to Odin. And Odin is not phased in the slightest. And you always wonder if he set this whole thing up from the start. So he preserves the head with spells so that he can use it to get the ongoing counsel of Mimir's head from beyond the grave. And to my mind, this is the most concentrated association of death and memory in the whole mythic corpus. We have the deity of death and otherworldliness reaching across the veil to draw back the reservoir of memory itself as a personified necromantic artifact for the purpose of nourishing his wisdom and understanding. Wow. To me, death, memory. So to further underscore this connection as well between death and fertility, Mimir is dead because the gods of fertility have killed him. But ironically, dead, he becomes more fruitful to Odin than Honir was to the Vanir when Mimir was alive. Okay, so having explored a little bit of this theme of death and how it fits in with memory, I'm going to talk a little bit about sleep and dreaming. And then once I've talked about that, I'm going to try and tie some of these threads and give a few kind of sort of testamentary kind of examples of how I think this works. So dreaming. So it's evident that dreaming and sleep, by implication by sleep, held a significance to the old heathens that has generally lost in the contemporary times, at least in the West. Only in the more imaginative branches of psychology is dreaming really accorded any interest these days. And I think it's really hard to appreciate how important dreams were in those times and places. You know, especially at liminal times like Yule. So nowhere is this more evident than in the place of dreams as literary devices in the myths and the sagas. So we have, for example, Baldur's prophetic dream of his own doom, which triggers so much chaos. In Florimana's saga, Thor appears and threatens a Christian in the Christian's dream, which I think is just hilarious. Thor and Christ have this whole, red Thor and white Christ, and they're always... And then in Vigga Glom's saga, Glom is sleeping and his maternal grandfather Vigfus appears to him and he passes on a sword, a cloak and a spear. And to my mind these are symbols of lineage and it's kind of analogous to passing on a name. The Brothers Grimm also describe the power of dreams, and we'll kind of touch on some of those in some of the folk tales that they recorded. Now, if dreams are a source of prophecy, as we see in Baldur's drama or in Njal's saga, then right away that connects them to memory, because there's no prophecy without memory. And in the Northern cosmology, there's only a very nebulous sense of the future, if we go with Boshatz's interpretation, which I kind of dig his interpretation. So if you want to talk about the future, if you want to do prophecy, you've really got to be grounded in the past, because it's, how do you generate some kind of intuition of what might happen? You've got to have that. Okay, so the past then leads us to death. So we have this triangle we need to form. So dreaming, but we don't just have to infer the relationship of dreaming to death. So in myth and sagas, when the dead are awakened and they complain about being roused from sleep, like literally, angry bear says, let me sleep. Angry seer, whatever it is, angry ghost. In the Brothers Grimm, they have all kinds of cool stuff. In the Moon, the dead are described as sleepers and the undead are described as being awoken. In Sleeping Beauty, the heroine is cursed to die, but another spellcaster comes along and she's able to modify the death into just being 100 years of magical sleep. She can't change the fundamental nature of what's happened to Sleeping Beauty, but she can modify the severity. In The Glass Coffin, the hero journeys to a subterranean world, maybe hell. That's H-E-L, not H-E-L-L, the heathen underworld. And there he awakes her and they become lovers. And it's almost like this waking dream sort of emerges out of this union. And I can't help but want to sort of say, wow, here's this symbol of this ego figure kind of goes into the underworld and there it encounters the personified unconscious, and then they have this union. And this is all very kind of Jungian psychology. That's kind of cool, So dreams often seem to be the means by which heroes are guided, for good or for ill. And they seem to bind the living and the dead. They seem to dissolve amnesia in memory's waters. There's a folktale called Death's Messengers, and in this folktale, Death, as a personified character, is menacing this person, and he says to this guy, "Has not my own brother Sleep reminded thee of me every night of me?" My own brother, Death himself, says that sleep is a close relation. And Grimm also talks about, in the old folk customs of talking about death and sleep in Germany. Death is an Ergreifer, one who seizes, but one who sleeps is gripped, seized. So they're linked even at that linguistic, everyday, casual level. And death and dreaming are both connected in the notion of journeying. So Grimm talks about the idea that for the old heathens, one's death is the occasion for travel to other realms. Hel, Odin, Freya, Ran, all call people to them. And the death deities are always traveling, trotting around the place, particularly Odin. He's always running around the place. And it's interesting, for example, well, there are examples. So Saxo Grammaticus describes a situation in which the goddess Hel, who is the goddess of the underworld, appears to someone in a dream. So she travels to the world living via a dream. And all this interworldly travel, for me, evokes the flowing waters moving through all the worlds through the tree. So, I've already started uniting the three concepts. So I'm following Bill Lindsay and Paul Borchardt, and I'm agreeing with them that the heathen worldview is elegantly presented in this image of the flowing remembrance through a living and dying cosmos. And then I'm adding to that the idea that we have death and dreaming, and that completes this picture of this cyclical, self-referential process. New layers are constantly being placed in the well, and then they constantly set the context for this evanescent present moment. It's a process. And I have this feeling like equilibrium is really important in this model. When imbalance occurs, disaster happens. And you can point to Ragnarok as maybe an example of that. But there's all kinds of small examples. In the sagas, when there's this terrible blood feud, it takes a long time to percolate and insults, and then maybe a killing, and then maybe another killing, and then 20 people are dead. This imbalance that accretes. Look at the current environmental plight we're in. I think it's the same exact process happening. Chaos, yes. And I was going to say something quickly about chaos and quantum mechanics, and I skipped it. But yeah, totally. This is all about that. It's all Mandelbrot sets, So this worldview of dreaming, death, and memory is necessarily ecological. Death and life feed one another. Forgetting provides the occasion and provocation for recollection. And yet without memories there can be no amnesia. Dreams give shape to our living. They provide the door through which we can experience imagination. But without wakefulness, those dreams couldn't come into concrete existence. They couldn't allow us to engage with this whole interworking process. So in modern times, there's this opposition that tends to get set up. Death versus life. We hate death, we want life. Memory and forgetting. Sleep and dreaming. Oh, you're just a dreamer. Wake up to yourself. But these kinds of conflicts are kind of surpassed if we're looking at the worldview in this way. There's always a tension between them. At the springtime, Grimm has accounts of, of the death of Winter being beaten out of the village. So there's always a tension. But there's also an equilibrium to that tension. So we're not trying to resolve anything. We're trying to sit on a fault line and just sort of move with it. It's almost like a cosmic equanimity. And that's kind of the spirit, I think, that's underlying a lot of this stuff. And I think if you look at a lot of these old customs in this way, it kind of gives them a richer sense. So I feel like, I see heathenry as being very life-affirming, and the basis of that is this almost embrace of the necessity of death. And, imagination, which I see as being connected to dreaming, is the basis for this very concrete, you read the sagas, they're just so concrete. Where does that come from? This really solid, tangible sense of life. It comes from this whole process of the dream, the dream that's being lived out into manifestation and then back into the dream again. And without amnesia, then there's no opportunity for rediscovery. If I don't slip away from my patron, then how can I learn to maintain that appreciation? It follows that such a worldview requires a great respect for mystery and the horizon of the unknown. And I think that's reflected in the old traditions of hospitality to strangers. This very sort of take the long view kind of thing you see in the Havamal, the long view of life, showing reverence to the natural world. And I think the modern heathenry would really benefit from incorporating these things more deeply into what we do now. So I want to suggest that the heathen attitude to death was a lot calmer and more assured than for what most people in contemporary times experience, even probably many heathens in contemporary times. And you can see even like, the afterlife is not seen to be an unpleasant place. You see that in Valhalla looks like a pretty cool place. You see it in some of the folk tales where people go to the underworld, like in Mother Hulda. Lovely places. If you look at hell, it's not brimstone. It's not hellfire. So there's not this need to demonize death. If death is going to bring us into a powerful sense of perspective, then it's going to help us to shed the inessential. And I think that that's what Odin is acting out when he hangs on the tree for 9 nights to win wisdom. By embracing death, he's given the opportunity to live a richer life. That's the message of that symbol. And I feel like that's a real, if I could say anything in this paper, like embrace death, really embrace it. Embrace it. I'm not saying that in a trivial way, like, a horror movie kind of way. I mean, like, really have a relationship with one. If I can have a relationship with my death, then I can begin to live. So I'd like to propose that in some ways, we have all these forms and structures to the mythology, and they're fragmentary. And I'm curious about the idea that, could you be a heathen just by having dreaming, death and memory as the basis of your worldview? And maybe not be fixated on particular gods or goddesses. And I think it would be an interesting experiment. I wonder about that. To what extent is there movement? Is there a rubberiness to the forms? To what extent is there something that kind of binds them together? But in any case, I'm going to, I'm going to turn now, and I'm going to sort of go back to some of the mythic material and just some other bits and pieces. And I'm going to try and show how this way of modelling the cosmology kind of fits with a few things that kind of demonstrate it, but also show why it can be a cool kind of lens to look at the mythology. So the first one I'm going to look at is 2 of Odin's names, Svafnir and Dragadrodn. Dragadrodn, Lord of the Dead. Svafnir, luller into sleep or luller into dreams. I always want to say provoker into dreams. So Odin's role as a death god is well established. He is the psychopomp par excellence. He's a traveller to the underworld. He's a ferryman for those that cross the boundaries that divide the worlds. His Valkyrie, he gets half of the battle slain by his Valkyries. He's the one that leads the army of the dead at Ragnarok. Okay, death god, easy. He dies on the tree. As a god of dreams, it's a little bit more tenuous. So despite being called Svafnir, it doesn't seem like there's any sources that specifically show him appearing in a dream. But there are definitely dreams that are associated with him. So Wodening cites several dreams that seem to bear his touch. For example, in Njal's saga, Njal was visited by Valkyries who bring a prophecy. Who else would send Valkyries? Probably Odin. Probably Odin. We can't say for sure, but it seems like not a bad guess. And it's interesting that dreaming at Yuletide, when Odin is riding the skies with the wild hunt, is a time where dreams are particularly portentous. We know that his relationship with memory is intimate. He sacrifices his eye to Mimir for a draught of the well's wisdom, or else preserves Mimir's head. And we know that he's a god of poetry. And we know that in a pre-literate oral culture, if you're a poet, you've got to be able to remember stuff. Vast amounts of stuff. Have you seen how thick the Poetic Edda is? Oh my goodness. And it's not just because of Lee Hollander's little commentaries. So the god of word mastery is by implication a god of memory mastery. And then this brings us round. Why is this emphasis on names? Well, as keys to the transmission of lineage. All these things link together. In his ordeal on the tree, Odin becomes, as far as I can figure out, the only figure in heathen mythology who embodies all 3 of these fundamental cosmological elements, dreaming, death and memory. On the tree he dies. On the tree he enters a trance, which to me, that's a dream. To the tree he is bound. So this is the channel of the waters of memory. And he looks down and he takes up the runes. And what will be hanging below him if he's looking down? The well of memory. And what comes of his simultaneous embrace of dreaming, death and memory? Runa. Odin is initiated into the horizon of mystery. And personally, I think that mystery is the essence of the universe. And perhaps the way for us to reach it is through this fusion of dreaming, death and memory. I want to say that, in my view, Odin was probably not always the king of the gods. Tacitus likens him to Mercury and not Zeus, even though Tacitus also says he was the most popular Germanic god. And I also wonder about this epithet All-Father that Odin has. And people attach this image of Odin on a throne, on the clouds. And it's kind of like Jehovah, and I sort of wonder if people maybe sometimes need to just separate out the Christianity stuff a little bit more. But I almost wonder if his primacy is not about being a great king or a great warrior, but being a great mystic. And for me, that's what I resonate with, and that's my bias. But I think there's something in that. So insofar as Odin is made on the tree, I mean, that's the critical moment for Odin as far as I'm concerned. The tree is the nexus of all. So maybe the All-Father, he's created from the all. It's not just that he's the father of all. I know there's this world, cosmological stuff, world-creating stuff, and we'll talk a little about that. But what a tantalizing idea. He's the father from all. And it helps me think, I think about Jan Fries. Jan Fries does this analysis of the myths of Taliesin and Sigurd, and this idea of moving from the consciousness of one thing to many things, to manifold things, to all. And I think it's interesting that death and sleep are both ergreifers. They're both Caesars. And Jung describes Odin as an ergreifer of men. And I wonder, what was Jung seeing in there? That he chose that word. That has this heritage, which I'm guessing he probably wasn't aware of. Maybe he was. But it's interesting. It's interesting.
Say the word again.
I'll spell it to you. That's E-R-G-R-E-I-F-E-R-S. Well, the S is for plural, yeah. I guess in German it would be ergreiferen, but anyway. All right. So that's kind of one way we can analyze, aspects of Odin through this lens. So let's talk about Ragnarok. Ragnarok represents the death of the gods and the birth of a new order. And a lot of people I've talked to in the heathen community really don't like this Ragnarok business. They really don't want to talk about this Ragnarok stuff. This is kind of bad news. We don't want to know about this. But if we approach it from the point of view that I'm talking about today, then death is a natural part of the process of life, and maybe we don't have to like Ragnarok. But why the antipathy? Why the fear and the hatred and the revulsion? Now, the Voluspa kind of alludes to the idea there's going to be a new world and there's going to be these shining blades and the gods are going to play some kind of board game, or their descendants, So that's pretty good, right? And Balder and Hod, who Odin tried so hard, and Frigga tried so hard to get Balder resurrected and they just couldn't get there. They get resurrected after Ragnarok. It's interesting, however, that sometimes people want to say that Odin gets somehow resurrected after Ragnarok, and I scoured the texts and I couldn't find any basis for that. So it must be UPG, and I wish those authors would just say, this is something that I kind of made up, and it's true for me, but, I wasted a lot of time trying to figure that one out. That's a pet peeve. People that present their own ideas and they're not clear about that, it really wastes a lot of time. So the fact that the various post-Ragnarok rebirths, I feel, lends a lot of support to the ideas here presented, and it shows how they kind of make a different, I think, richer way of looking at Ragnarok. And also, this new dragon kind of rises up as well. So the forces of destruction and death also are kind of reborn. And that's important as well. There's always this package, this process, this cyclical process. And I think it's interesting, if you look at the beginning of the world, Odin and his brothers Vili and Ve, they get together, they murder Ymir, and they dismember him, and they build the world out of the corpse. So we have this death, and that creates the new world, and then at the end of that stretch of the world, you have a war, and everything dies, and then another new world is built. So why are we so afraid of death? If we see Ragnarok as necessary and even in a way positive, it's possible that we have to temper our knee-jerk hatred of Loki and Surt and all these characters, and Fenris. Because intentional or not, and wherever they're coming from, their violent deeds, their treachery, whatever it is you want to call it, it's necessary for this rebirth to happen. And also, sometimes you hear the idea that Odin wants to delay Ragnarok. But again, I couldn't really find anything that was very clearly saying that at all. And I wonder if he really was trying to delay Ragnarok. And it makes me dwell on something that Sven Plowright says. He says, part of Odin's power is his end and foreknowledge of that end. Part of Odin's power is his end. So perhaps Odin, whose understanding of the deep connections of dreaming, death and memory is unsurpassed, And I feel like maybe I can say that at this point. Perhaps he does not fear Ragnarok. Perhaps to him it is a necessity. How else is he going to save Balder from the grave? At the very least, if we agree with Heidegger that death releases us to an authentic possibility for being, it follows that even Odin stands to lead a richer life, to be a richer being, if he's doing that in the face of mortality. So to come back to this idea about Odin being reborn or Odin being immortal, imposing that on him, to my mind, is actually denying him his full beauty. Odin dies. Odin is dead. Odin is dead. But what happens to the dead? There could even be some truth about, if you've read American Gods, and Odin and Loki are co-conspirators in the name of this bigger picture. And it's so funny because I read that book after I first had this idea, so I was like, damn, now I can't claim it as mine. But I think it's kind of a fun idea, and I don't know that I would ever want to necessarily be like, yeah, this is what it is. But what a fun idea to explore, And how many contradictory versions of the myths are there even in the sources, in the tiny fragment of what's left anyway? Why not just throw in a little bit more chaos? As long as we're really obvious and clear, like, I'm making this stuff up. I've got no problem with that. There's another dimension to this, Out of fearfulness, the gods attempt to make Balder immortal because he has a dream that he's going to die. Fear of death, it's a fundamental violation of their cosmos. And in a way, that suggests that maybe in doing so, they're the ones that trigger Ragnarok, the events that lead to Ragnarok. Maybe, I'm partial to the view that maybe Loki is not as heavily involved in Balder's assassination as we generally think, and there's a lot of interesting literature on that, some of which is no longer available online, but if anyone wants it, I can send it to you. So I'm kind of looking at the sources really closely. He's a jerk, but not that big a jerk. It's kind of the message. Actually, I like Loki, but he's a jerk. He doesn't mind you. If you can't handle that, then yeah. Maybe Loki's deeds are ultimately in the interest of the cosmic order. There's all these stories where Loki gets into some kind of trouble, and out of that, now we get to have Mjolnir and Skiplatnir and Dropnir, like all this cool stuff. Maybe Ragnarok is kind of like a bigger, uglier version of those smaller stories of how Loki does something bad, but it ends up working out better. I don't know. Maybe. Okay, so we're coming close to the end, and I appreciate your patience. Heathenry, Christianity, and modernity. Oh, I had this picture I was going to have up here of St. Boniface, the wonderful St. Boniface, the pillar of grace and wonder, with a big axe hacking down Thor's oak, as he famously did. A symbol of love and compassion as he hewed the great tree down. So Brian Bates talks about the conflict between Christianity and heathenry, and he says it was a fight over who could claim to control the numinous. So he says, look, what do the Christians do? They usurped the sacred wells, the temple sites, and when they couldn't get rid of a folk practice, they adopted it and said it was Christian all along. So the deep question of how to experience the world, is it inherently divine or is it only divine by God's grace? That was what was being fought over here. This is powerful stuff. So what about Christianity? Christianity is founded on the revelation of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. To my mind, that's an attempt to preserve life, not by trusting to the cyclical order of the cosmos, but just by abolishing death. No death here, no. Come back in 3 days. Yet if death is intimately fused to dreaming and memory, to this whole flowing cosmos, that's really scary. If you got a tricycle and you just took out one wheel. And I think about sleep deprivation, the effect of sleep deprivation on someone over the long term. Imagine that written across a whole culture, across a whole planet. Now switch that from sleep deprivation and substitute death deprivation, right?
I think that was a torture ability.
Oh my. Yeah, it was too. It was, yeah. So I'm trying to teach myself not to be bigoted against Christianity, and there's definitely some cool things about it, and there's some Christians I really admire deeply, and I think are wonderful people. But I think that it's hard to argue that Christianity as an institution has been a force for closed-mindedness, inhibition, authoritarian control, corruption, injustice, narrowness, life denial. We could add socioeconomic oppression, we could add homophobia, we could add racism, we could add gender oppression, we could add it never really ends. By seeking to suppress death, the risk is that you create a devil where a god could be. Break the cycle of fertility, strip the world of mystery and hence meaning. This whole concept of removing meaning from being immanent in the world to being in the logos, removed somewhere else. That's why Nietzsche declared that God is dead. It was just like, well, we've made it unbelievable. Like, there's no more relevance to any of this structure. Philosophers have made God so far removed from anything that's important. Why are we even bothering to posit God? You know. So he didn't have the solution to the problem. He just wanted to cut the head off. But actually, you need the head. You need the head. Preserve the head. I like Nietzsche, but he's definitely got some problems. Yeah. And I feel like these limitations that Christianity demonstrates are a powerful vindication of the heathen worldview, or at least the way that I've articulated it here today. And maybe you think that what I'm saying is a lot of crap, and in that case, cool. But if you do think that something's what I'm saying, then I think that is interesting. Then when we sit that next to Christianity. It's almost as though for Christianity, it really struggles to endure that poignant tension of contrast that I see as being so essential to heathen cosmology. So the heathen worldview sees fertility in the uneasy camaraderie of death and sleep, of death and life, sleep and waking, remembering and forgetting, whereas Christianity seems to want to reduce these beautiful ambiguities into simplistic divisions. So we really need to divest ourselves of this dualistic divisiveness if we want to be good heathens. Not necessarily just good heathens, but for the sake of argument. It really imposes false polarities upon existence, which is in fact a streaming continuum. It allows us to project our own disowned limitations onto the other. You, that thing over there. Now I can invest all of the things that are bad about me and say it's you. In the extreme, I think about Catholic confession. I was thinking about this. It almost like if I go and confess my sins and the cleric says, 10 Hail Marys and off you go. It's like, forget, let's just, it's all done now. It's resolved. As though you could ever make anything unmade. You could ever unmake anything once it's made. I don't think you can unmake anything once it's made. You can transform its meaning subsequently. But you can't unmake it. And I see this modern world, which is disenchanted, it's stripped of meaning. It's dominated by technocracy and utilitarianism. It's a world where dreaming and memory have been silenced. Under the banner of pearly white technological positivism, we have sought to symbolically abolish death. And I always think about, the cosmetic industry, the plastic surgery industry. Wow, what a mentality. If we look at, the way that, cultures are collapsing, that the entire world environment is collapsing. We are disrupting the cycles of cosmic fertility because we are not attentive to this continuum of existence, this flowing tree of memory and death and dreaming. So, I'm not saying that modernity is necessarily this bad thing, but it seems to me that we have this thing called science, which is the quest for knowledge, and then we have its technological application, and that application has often lacked the better part of prudent caution and human idealism. And if you disagree with me, then let's just talk about the Pacific Gyre. Let's talk about climate change. Let's talk about DDT. Let's talk about all these things. Let's talk about the fact that we're currently in the sixth mass extinction, and the first mass extinction to be caused by one species. Yeah, great. I don't think that we're capable of handling science unless we have this holistic worldview. Now, as I mentioned, the ASIA also seem to demonstrate some kind of Christian-like fear of death in terms of Boulder. And I don't want to say that we mustn't fear death, because death is a scary thing and that's a totally legitimate thing. But the problem is that I feel with Christianity, you have this thing where you're reducing the foundation of consciousness to a fear of death. And that's a disaster. So I'd like to think that this reading of the heathen worldview might become an inspiration for some positive healing processes. Maybe in the heathen community, maybe not in the heathen community. But I'd like to think that there's some kind of seed for some kind of positive development, and that heathens are not just spiritual narcissists. So the last part of my presentation is called Stepping Through the Door of Myth. And I'm going to give you another quote. This is from a Norwegian band called Enslaved. And the quote is this: "Doors open wide, step into the light. No turning back, embrace the night. Breathe eternities. We are not alone. Never to return, merge with the unknown." It should be evident from the foregoing that mythological imagery is not an end in itself. Those who become rigidly obsessed only with the forms that a religion or mythology or culture take tend to lose their grasp on the very purpose of those forms. Habituation, right? Amnesia. The forms are there to provide us a way for us to expand our understanding of the cosmos beyond the limits of our everyday assumptions, our habits, our conventions, our cognitive capacities. Metaphor and symbols speak to us in rich layers, enabling a depth of communication that explicit didactic words cannot afford. Myths speak to our spirits as well as our minds, to the very cells of our flesh, and they must be cultivated or they will fade into amnesiac shadows. The consequences of our relation to myth are vast. And I use myth here in the broadest of senses, because anything can be mythic, for good or ill, whether it be religion, politics, poetry, art, music, anything, personal relationships. We humans, we instinctively imprint the trappings of our experience with mythic watermarks, whether we know it or not. And we do it all the time. Our world is woven from imagination. And this can work for us and against us. But often we lack the perspective to understand the significance of our deeds or their consequences. Any body of myths, any group of myths, any set of myths can afford us a glimpse through to the unknown, as Crowley put it. Let's go back to that quote. Awake from waking, the truth is the unknown. The best myths enable us to find a meaningful niche within the huge reaches of existence, to recognise the sentience of all things, but this is important without devolving into rigid, reactive superstition either. The important image of Germanic cosmology is not the image of the world tree. It's the suggestion of this vast, interconnected, living, cyclical, unimaginably complex cosmos that surges ineluctably within that image. But, and here's the fun thing, the reverse is also true. So I want to suggest that ultimately we have to surpass all myths. We have to step through the doors of the myths. Myth is a door. If you leave the door closed and worship the closed door, then forget it. If you open the door and step through, oh, now we're talking. And how we do that? Sacred experiences. The very experiences from which myths spring. And they could be dramatic and non-ordinary, or they could just be small, simple daily remembrances. Remembrances of the living death that embraces us, even in moments of waking amnesia. They might be the small, random moments when we recall the fragility and majesty of being alive, the audacity and humility that is required of each of us to live the truth of our oneness and difference, our oneness and separateness from this infinite recursive domain in which we find ourselves. To go beyond myth is not permanent. We always come back. Those doors are not inessential. They're critical. Jung talks about the idea that the structure of religion is valuable because too much of a good thing will destroy us completely. We need something, a harbour to come back to. So the forms and the spirit and the experience of spirit are both essential. Again, delicate equilibrium. And I've tried to, in this paper, it's a very reconstructionist angle I've taken, and yet I feel like I've tried very hard to seed it with something that's not just about what it says on page 73 of the Poetic Edda. So this presentation was seeded. It was given. A disembodied voice right here said to me, Ymir is dead and Ymir dreams. Odin, Vili and Ve murdered Ymir and they dismember his body and they arrange it, I guess around the world tree, it doesn't really say, but they arrange it into the worlds. His brains become the clouds and his blood becomes the seas and et cetera, and the mountains, the bones and the fabric of our earth, of our lives, the flesh of our bodies is woven from a corpse. But it's a corpse through which life still flows. It's as though the universe is sentient. Everything in it is sentient and composed from a body. It's almost like that mind-body split is totally destroyed. Everything is made out of body. Allowing the claim that the dead are dreamers, it seems that in a sense we are all dead. We are all dead. So who cares if Odin dies? We are all dead. And we're all dreaming in a world woven from the same. And think about this. When we remember, put a hyphen there, the essence of this dismembered world, we discover that death and life are one. And Odin, Vili and Ve are not really murderers at all. Rather, they have given the substance of Ymir, from which we are all woven, the opportunity to discover itself in a dreaming wakefulness or a wakeful dream. So it seems to me that when we invoke the eerie presence of death, the fleeting grace of dreaming, and the liquid touch of memory, we reconnect ourselves to an ancient and powerful lineage. We are human beings formed of ash and elm by three wise and powerful deities. If we care to live reverentially, to embrace the beauty of the world that they created, then we might yet hope to inherit the Hamingia, the magic power of the name heathen.